the Pope decided today to release Vatican-related bath products. The incredible thing, yes, it's the new Pope on the rope. It's right, Pope on a rope. Wash with it, go straight to heaven. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. My name is Dr. Bill Roach. This is another episode of Timeless Dialogues. And today we're going to ask this question. Can I be anti-woke and not be a Christian nationalist? Because I think what we're starting to find on the internet is that many of the people who were anti-woke seem to be split on this issue. You have all these people that are jumping into one camp of saying, you know, the faithful biblical way to approach these issues is to become a Christian nationalist, whatever that means. And then you have other figures like myself who say, I do not want to be a Christian nationalist because I know exactly what they're trying to do with it, and I don't want to go down that route. So today what I want to do is I want to look at that venture. But before we do, what I want to do is let you in on a little bit of a trip that we did. We recently just got back from Boston, and we went to Maine. And one of the things that we did in Boston is we just went and looked at, you know, many of the historical sites. But I want to let you know about this one site that we visited. It was a statue of a woman named Mary Dyer. And Mary Dyer was a Quaker woman. And why that's important is that I actually grew up in the first town that was planted by Quakers west of the Mississippi, like the first Quaker church that was there. So growing up, you would always hear different people talking about, you know, who the Quakers were, what they did with the Underground Railroad. So there were several people that I knew who said, hey, will you please, you know, get a picture of this or make a video about it? So I did. So what I want to do is, instead of me talking about it again, I have an okay video quality, but I want to share to you who is Mary Dyer and then kind of bring it into this discussion here. So let's pull this up here.
We're here in Boston, and behind me is Mary Dyer, who was the wife of William Dyer. The Dyers were Puritans who came here in search of religious liberty. Now, while they were here, Mary actually became pregnant, and through a variety of unfortunate circumstances, she had the child early, and the child passed away. And one of the things that was said is one of the reasons that her child was deformed and passed away was because she wasn't following the right religion. And what that means is at one point in time, Mary Dyer converted to Quakerism. And many of the Puritans saw that as outside of the bounds of what they wanted to protect as a proper religion. So in her pursuit of religious freedom, she actually paid for it with her life. And this statue is here to commemorate that. So when she was a Quaker and holding meetings, they passed laws against Quakerism. And through a variety of acts, they actually hung Mary Dyer. And this whole statue serves as what it says here: my life not availeth me in comparison to the liberty of truth. And that's one of the bedrock pillars of the United States: freedom of religion and freedom of speech.
So what I want you to what I want you to see from that is that as we discuss this issue, you know, the whole issue of religious freedom is something that's of great importance. In fact, you know, I'm not in favor of some of the particularities of Quakerism. I don't believe in their spiritual communion concept. I don't believe in their notion of sort of the inner light coming in. I don't believe in their concept of the ordination of women, but I do believe in their concept of religious freedom. And, you know, there's a lot of talk today about how we need to recover our Reformed heritage. We need to get back to the Reformers. We need to get back to the Puritans. But it's funny because I've taught several courses on Puritanism, and I will tell you, there are many good things in Puritanism. Like I highly endorse several of the things of Puritanism, but it's not like they were just this, you know, squeaky clean movement that never had any issues that went along with it. And if you read any of the, you know, specific books on it by like Leland Ryken or by Lloyd Jones or by Beakey or J.I. Packer, or really any good historian on this, they're going to recognize there were good things and bad things by the Puritans. And one of the bad things that some of them advocated for were these things against a figure like Mary Dyer. You know, just because she was holding religious services that you would disagree with is no reason to kill the woman. And what's interesting is that this happened before the founding of the country. And her death actually became a pillar in sort of the Boston Commons and greater Boston area there for religious freedom. And it undergirded what became our religious freedom ideals and our freedom of speech ideals within the U.S. Constitution. And one of the things that we have to see is that that's an important sort of topic for us to consider as we turn into this whole Christian nationalist issue. So what I want to do here is I want us to consider this whole issue of what is going on with this sort of anti-Christian nationalist, Christian nationalist movement, and as it relates to the anti-woke movement. And, I was reflecting upon this because, there were several figures who were against the woke movement, and we know exactly how it functioned. We started to see these things coming into our seminaries. We started seeing them hit the SBC, aspects of the PCA. They were all over mainline denominationalism. The Gospel Coalition was starting to buy into it. And we all realized, I think individually, we've got to stand up against this movement. Now, I'll readily admit that it was something that I saw happening within one of the schools that I was at. They were changing policies for your syllabi and the books that you were supposed to require students to read. They were changing all the programs and the funding. It was literally just becoming sort of the whole focal point of the seminary. And then I saw other figures, and I don't actually want to list really names today, because what happens is you list one or you list two and you forget one or you forget the other, and it becomes this issue that I just really don't want to go down. But what I did notice is that there was in many ways a coalition of figures who were starting to fight this movement. And what they were doing is they were, putting out things like the Dallas Statement against social justice. And that really was a battle cry. You saw things coming up against, Resolution 9 within the SBC. You saw podcasts dropping. You saw people speaking out against it. And each figure sort of started to coalesce around, we need to fight this movement, really for a variety of reasons. I can speak to my reasons. One, I saw it attacking the very concept of truth, because it's a very subjective epistemology. It's theory of knowledge. Doesn't give me this concept of objective truth. And what that might mean is that I don't have an objective understanding of the Bible. I don't have an absolute proposition to hang the Christian faith on, and these different concepts there. In addition to it, I saw it actually attacking the very purity of the gospel itself, namely the idea that we are saved by grace through faith in Christ alone, grace alone, faith alone, Christ alone, for the glory of God alone, and the Bible alone. And when these figures were starting to attack this, it was very clear what was going on. And we were very familiar with it. Now, what happened was that several disconnected people started to become connected figures. And in those connected efforts, you saw, documentaries dropping, conferences held, and it looked like we had a strong force of figures to fight this movement. And that was a great thing, because what it did is it gave us a united voice, and it gave us a stronger, louder voice in the conversation. And I'm not going to say that I was a leading figure in that. I was one small person who worked in that whole realm there, even though I saw it, and I really faced several of the consequences for it. I'm no longer teaching at certain schools because I resigned. I didn't want to teach at them. I knew exactly where they were going, and I really just didn't want to have somebody police my efforts to stand for the concept of truth. And in many respects, I also saw it affect things like friendships, where there are people who clearly went woke. I mean, they clearly had bought into the whole movement and drank the Kool-Aid. And in the midst of it, it was starting to divide friendships. It was dividing churches. I'm no longer at the church that I'm at, because part of the whole Me Too movement and this whole woke movement split the church. And there were other issues, very specific issues within it. So I know that I faced several things in the midst of it, but several other figures did too. And what it did is it created this movement of people who had been deeply affected and gave us a larger voice to it. And what we did is we were able in many respects to hold it back. Now, obviously, if you look at the culture today, you know for a fact that the woke movement is alive and well. And I don't think that it's actually dead within the SBC. I don't think that it's dead even within segments of the PCA or broader evangelicalism. I think that it's really just kind of gone into a little bit of hiding. And what I'm finding is that several of these things are turning into, these are just readily accepted, because as we all know, what's happened is that we really didn't hold those accountable who brought these movements in. The key presidents of seminaries, leaders within denominations, teachers who are putting out books, and all the rest. And part of it is that I think we didn't push hard enough in that regard. But in another respect, I think what's happened is that this is kind of like part two, is that the whole anti-woke movement has been on a massive mission drift. We were here to fight for the concept of truth and fight for the purity of the gospel and fight for the purity of local churches. But now we're fighting over this Christian nationalist movement. And for those of you who are listening, you got to ask yourself why. Like literally, why is this happening? And I don't want to make this video too long, but what I want you to see is that this whole issue just reeks of some kind of balkanization, almost Fed job that's going on within evangelicalism. The woke movement split it right down the middle, and then whatever was left of the fragment of sort of this Christian right is now being split on this issue. And it's interesting because, you know, like anything, you have groups of people that talk. They talk through, you know, text messages, signal groups, through Facebook groups. They talk on the phone, whatever means of it. And then all of a sudden I noticed there were like new figures on the scene that, you know, a year ago you had no clue who they were, but now they're leading Christian nationalists that are going to give you their prophetic voice on these topics. And I remember I had a conversation with one of these figures because this person thought that, you know, oh, I couldn't be trusted on standing for the truth of whatever this was because of an association that I had with another leading figure on the anti-woke movement. And those two had gotten into an internet spat. And I remember this guy was, you know, oh, how can you question my motives, or how can you question this? And he was so mad that I didn't follow him and interact with him on Twitter. And this particular person, like I know, like I've seen his signal messages, I've seen these other things. He was clearly getting into arguments on Twitter in order to build his Twitter followers and to increase the numbers of people who were following him. And literally, I just thought to myself, like, this guy is like a 7th grade girl. Like, what is this, junior high mean girls all over again? And it's just, you had to have absolute commitment onto him. And if you didn't, you were not trustworthy. And I knew right then and there, I was like, this guy is not a figure that I want to partner with. And it was at that moment I started to really see what the Christian nationalist movement was doing, is it was giving this whole friend-enemy distinction. If you're not my absolute friend, you're my enemy. If you're not following my specific purity test, if you're willing to, you know, side with somebody that may differ with me on this, well, you can't be my friend. You're not meeting my purity test. And then I started to watch as it sort of worked its way out in social media. It's that you start to see the Christian nationalist movement start to infiltrate sort of other groups. And I was appalled when I saw key movements, key figures within Fighting Resolution 9 and standing against the woke movement, fulfilling like almost all of the expectations of those on the left. Like, you're now labeling yourself a Christian nationalist. And here's the reality of it. You know, you don't, in this day and age with the postmodern turn and the way this is being used in the narrative of it, you don't just like, oh, I get to define the term the way that I want. You have to deal with the historical background of the movement. And what's interesting is that one of the books on Christian nationalism specifically states that the author does that he doesn't want to deal with the historical baggage of the term. And my thought is that's specifically where you have to engage this, because the historical baggage is, well, part of the baggage. And you started seeing these figures who were labeling themselves like this. And I'm listening to people that are sort of these moderate leftists within evangelicalism going, see, we've been telling you that the whole time. But in addition to it, I started to look at like, what is this movement and how does this movement sort of function and what does it look like? And you started to see this term that was known as integralism playing about, where you start to see sort of this merging of the church and the state in order to have the state enforce the purity laws within a church or doctrinal laws within a church or the ethical laws within the church. And even the top book on Christian nationalism doesn't come out and say, I'm an integralist, because I don't know why he doesn't motivationally. I never try to read motives with it. But one of the things is that his book is clearly a case of integralism. His whole book, as spelled out by one of the key book reviews of it, it's a Hegelian concept of the state. And that's why when I started to see the integralism, I started to see this ethnic totalitarianism coming about with it. I started seeing the balkanization concepts. We need to have the left and the right split into their own states. I started to see the business ventures coming about where people are starting businesses to sell you property in order to somehow get you on a parallel economy. You started to see some of these things where there's a lot of money being spent to promote specific views and specific, financial endeavors. And some of these things, even like what really got me was the way that they started to side with groups where you're like, you call your main leader the Maxim leader. Like, this reeks of everything that's almost similar unto a cult in this regard. So here's what I want you to see is that many of the Christian nationalists on this will just write this off as I'm totally, utterly misrepresenting them. Well, here's what I want you to know. I got a whole video coming out about it here in just a matter of weeks. So go find that. It's actually going to be titled The Danger and Draw of Christian Nationalism. And what I do is I lay out all the quotes, all the key points of it. And I would just encourage you to go watch that. Like, I'm just giving generalizations in this video, so don't knock anything there. But what I want you to see is that the problem that we're facing is that the anti-woke movement, unfortunately, got caught up in the Christian nationalist debate. And there are some figures within the Christian nationalist side who did excellent work against the woke movement. And then they've stopped. And I would just plead with you and encourage you, return back to that which was doing the most good for the church. Like, this movement here is not helping you in any regard. It's actually, in many respects, fracturing and undoing many of the good things that you did in the past. So can you, I'll just leave this. I want this to be a short video. Can you be anti-woke and still be against Christian nationalism? And the answer is already, yes, you can. Why? Because you don't have to buy into their post-liberal concepts and the concepts of blasphemy laws and the issues of balkanization and integralism and all of the other things that go along with sort of the ism and the schism of Christian nationalism. You can rightly stand where you've stood for decades before in believing in the concept of religious freedom and freedom of speech, and you don't have to revert back to some magisterial reformed understanding, which doesn't even have a monolithic understanding within the literature. And even if you just look at it confessionally, like, there's a reason we have the Americanized version of the Westminster Confession of Faith. I think it's actually a better section there because it recognizes the concept of religious freedom in the context of the American project. So can you? Yes, you can. Should you? Yes, you should. You should remain anti-woke and against the Christian nationalist movement. Why? Because history tells us over and over again, even within conservative Protestant movements, that religious freedom is something worth fighting for. And as much as the Puritans thought they were right with Mary Dyer, they were clearly wrong in that. That woman did not deserve to lose her life for holding Quaker meetings. And as we apply it to this today, people don't need to be imprisoned, banished, or sentenced to death. Those are actual 3 legitimate concepts being put forth by Christian nationalism in order to preserve the purity of whatever they see as their vision for church-state relationships. So with that, what I want us to see here is that we can stand against this movement, and we should stand against this movement. So again, I hope that you have a great time. Please share and forward.